I would now like to introduce our lecturer, Barbara. She is the former curator of books at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard University's Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies. And through her years at the Schlesinger Library, she's developed one of the country's most important collections of cookbooks and books on food history. In fact, over 16,000 volumes. And she's helped secure the papers of such food notables as M.F.K. Fisher and Julia Child. So please help me in welcoming Barbara Haber. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the intrepid souls who came out today. Not the best of weather, but I think we're used to it by now. I'm going to start with a story of a group of Bostonians who were very well intentioned, and they started a project that they had every hope would be hugely successful, but it failed. I came across the story almost as a footnote in something I read, and I got extremely interested in what it represented to me. And I'll talk about the context in a little while. The people I'm talking about were well-born Bostonians who decided to help the working poor by changing the way that poor folks ate. Now, the reformers, and this was in the age of reform around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. We no longer can say turn of the century, and everybody knows what we mean. They were white, they were Protestant, most of them, had an English background, while the people that they were trying to help were Irish, or they were from Eastern and Southern Europe. They were Catholics, they were Jews, and this was a time, of course, when waves and waves of immigrants were coming into the country. So that's just a little bit about why I got interested in the story, and here it goes. Shopping for groceries these days is like stepping through a minefield as we cautiously pick our way through the aisles, selecting foods we hope will not kill us. This fear is inspired by the current bombardment of nutritional advice we are getting from assorted experts who warn us of the dangers in such all-American favorites as red meat, dairy products, and sweets. We begin to long for earlier times when people were left alone to enjoy a salami sandwich in peace. But were they? More than 100 years ago, some privileged Bostonians formed an enterprise called the New England Kitchen in an attempt to uplift the poor by educating them to eat food that was cheap, nourishing, and hygienic. Reformers to the core, the group included chemist Ellen Richards, the first woman to enter MIT, Mary Hinman Abel, a domestic scientist. This was the age of that new profession of home economists, and Edward Atkinson, a businessman, an inventor of a gadget called the Aladdin oven, a device capable of producing stews, chowders, and porridge through long, slow cooking. That these three people were able to pool their resources and work well together is not surprising. Ellen Richards had a passion for science, believing it could solve such everyday public health problems as unsanitary food and impure water. She had a long career devoted to those issues. Mary Abel was an early proponent of the home economics movement, and she had seen for herself, she had gone to Berlin, Germany, and where they'd had Volksküchen, people's kitchens, which served cheap, nourishing food to the city's working class. And then there was Edward Atkinson, whose invention was meant to nourish the poor for little money. And he knew members of the Boston business community who could finance this trio's shared dream. These well-meaning founders opened the first kitchen at 142 Pleasant Street in Boston on the first day of January in 1890. It was planned all through the year before. And from the start, their intention was to sell cooked food for home consumption at around 15 cents a meal. And customers were expected to provide their own containers to carry away such fare as beef broth, cornmeal mush, pea soup, Indian pudding, and oatmeal cakes. English, a bit stodgy. Cooking went on in full view as a demonstration of cleanliness, a concept that was extended to the conditions of the jars, bowls, and pots brought in by purchasers who were roundly criticized if their pots were deemed to be dirty. The reformers had it in mind to someday open a restaurant within the kitchen, in part as a way to attract men and keep them out of saloons. This theme of keeping men out of saloons is right through the literature of 19th century domestic literature. Women who were responsible for the domestic sphere, if they didn't keep house well and cook meals well, then their husbands might wind up in saloons. There was always that threat. And well-intentioned folks tried to wrap themselves around that and find ways to rid. There was a real scourge of drunkenness all through the 19th century. People started drinking early in the morning, beer for breakfast, that sort of thing. It's true. In order to produce dishes that were exactly the same each time they were cooked, enormous effort went into standardizing the foods served in the New England kitchen, measuring and weighing and repeatedly testing recipes. Information had only recently been discovered about calories. It's amazing how new everything we know about nutrition is really 20th century. Maybe end of the 19th century. People only learned then about calories and the composition of food regarding protein, carbohydrates, and fats. This new knowledge had led to a movement towards scientific cooking, a buzzword that characterized the professionalization of housework as a systematic pursuit of human health. Domestic scientists believed it their duty to protect the nutritionally naive from their own ignorance. This atmosphere of dietary enlightenment, combined with the zeal of the reformer and a continuing supply of private money from Boston connections, encouraged the founders of the New England kitchen to open more of their establishments. One was opened up on Tremont Street and another on Salem Street in the north end of Boston. Then as now, Boston's neighborhoods had distinct ethnic identities, and it is fair to say that the popularity of the food cooked and sold by the kitchen correlated with how close each group was to traditional Yankee culture. Americans, English, and some Irish were said to have liked the dishes, whereas people living in the North End, Jews, Portuguese, and Italians, were judged, quote, incorrigible, or as Mary Abel commented, quote, the number of those who are intelligent enough to appreciate the nature of the food is too few, unquote. I was able to write about this group because I found a wonderful cache of articles that Abel and Richards had written way in the bowels of Widener Library at Harvard that described their take on this, quote, noble experiment. And she found the people who didn't like the food incorrigible. Even an Irish mother who had been pressed to take an Indian pudding home to her children replied, quote, my boy says, oh, you can't make a Yankee out of me that way. Here in a nutshell was the problem facing the New England kitchen. How could their food appeal to all of the populations they were trying to serve? The idea of creating dishes tailored to immigrant tastes was dismissed as economically unfeasible because only a few would buy them, and the kitchen's menus were standardized to keep costs down and to appeal to the broadest tastes. But there's another reason for the kitchen's founders to cling to their own Yankee traditions. As educated Bostonians, they felt that the waves of newcomers entering the city could be hastened along in their assimilation by adapting to Yankee customs. The New England kitchen was seen as a powerful agent of that process. It was social engineering, in other words. The well-meaning hope of Americanizing the newly arrived blindsided these reformers, rendering them insensitive to the well-established customs of their would-be customers, especially regarding food. Mrs. Abel was critical of the fact that ethnic bakeries had sprung up, particularly in Jewish and Italian neighborhoods, an indication to her that people were wasting their money on food that should have been prepared at home. She had worked hard to develop and distribute a recipe for health bread that she envisioned would be eaten by all. And this bread consisted of large amounts of oatmeal gruel and molasses and baked into soft loaves. These breads had no appeal to Italians and Jews, whose crusty loaves were a traditional staple. So important was their own bread to these groups that they relied almost exclusively on professional bakers to produce it. To this day, this is true. A related insensitivity was exhibited by Mrs. Abel, who defensively comments in one of these leaflets that I read, quote, no one thing has been so severely criticized as the use of pork in some of the dishes, but the results have justified it. It enters into the food of the common people nearly the world over. End of quote. At no time did she indicate an awareness that pork was forbidden from the diet of Jews, and moreover that their dietary laws would have prevented them from buying and eating any of the foods prepared in this decidedly non-kosher New England kitchen. Fresh fruits and vegetables, or rather the lack of them, were another reason why people in the Boston neighborhoods, particularly the Italians, shied away from the kitchen. Salad greens and other highly perishable produce were never included in the standardized meals, for they would have boosted the cost of such food above the 15-cent per meal limit. All fresh food purchased by the kitchen were those that could be stored and used gradually: potatoes, root vegetables, and apples. And it was around this time that the Italians connected with Italian growers in Napa Valley in California, so that railroads were delivering fresh vegetables and fruits from Napa to depots in all of the major eastern American cities. That and gardening themselves in their own backyards was very Italian. The kitchen's abstinence from garlic, a decidedly un-American food, is another indication of the prevailing social prejudice. Strong-smelling foods were considered distinctly foreign and somehow repulsive to New England noses. In fact, it was the sight of a foreign-born workman eating a salami sandwich that provoked Edward Atkinson to develop his Aladdin oven. It was his hope that every working person carrying a portable oven would someday be able to eat a properly cooked hot meal for his lunchtime break instead of the strange-looking cold meats he usually ate. It should come as no surprise that the New England kitchen, noble experiment though it was, finally was a failure. As far as Ellen Richards was concerned, quote, its death knell was sounded by the woman who said, "I don't want to eat what's good for me. I'd rather eat what I'd rather." The moments of success it could claim, however, were outside of its own stated goal, which was to inspire working people to eat healthy foods prepared under sanitary conditions at low cost. One of the first recipes developed by the kitchen, beef broth, was never embraced by the masses, but was instead purchased by local doctors who delivered it to invalid patients. This may explain why this dish even today is a staple hospital food. Another unforeseen success inaugurated by the kitchen was its role in establishing the first school lunch program in Boston, and for that matter, the nation. Until 1894, the job of serving food to high school students had been given to the school janitors, who had established little sideline businesses by bringing in food. Deciding that it was time for change, the school committee negotiated with the New England kitchen to set up a central facility that could deliver meals to each of the high schools. Lunchrooms were hastily set up, usually in the basements of the schools, and Ellen Richards and her crew managed to deliver such fare as soup, sandwiches, meat pies, scallop dishes, cakes, and puddings. In the beginning, opposition came from the janitors, of course, but also from neighboring shopkeepers who displayed signs saying, "Here you can get what you want to eat, and not what the school committee says you must." That's so American. A sentiment that smacks of American individualism, not to mention capitalist competitiveness. So what finally are we to think about this, quote, noble experiment? It was, after all, the first American attempt to open a public kitchen for the purpose of providing people with healthy food and educating them to prepare such meals for themselves. It also foreshadows the kind of takeout services springing up today, what are known in the trade as whole meal replacement retail shops. Used to be Boston Chicken, Boston Market, that concept. In any case, many of us will realize that we have the New England kitchen to thank for the stodgy, though nutritious lunches we all may remember complaining about as school children. But as the story of the kitchen also dramatizes the difficulties inherent in getting people to change their eating habits. Food is not merely the sum of its scientific parts, but embodies the special meanings that people give to it. Unlike the animals, we give meaning to our food, symbolic meaning. We're attached. It means comfort. It means indulgence. It means sexy, whatever, you know. What we say about chocolate and all of that. Dogs and cats don't do that. When food is seen as a symbol of proud national identity and family life, people simply refuse to give up their traditional dishes. When they do, it is rarely because of food reformers like the founders of the New England kitchen, but the pressure of market forces enticing us to embrace heavily advertised foods that are now regarded as typically American. School lunch programs are evidence. Started by home economists seeking to guarantee at least one nutritionally good meal a day for children, School lunches in many communities are supplied by fast food chains whose hamburgers, pizzas, and tacos are generally too loaded with salt and fat to qualify as healthy. The problems faced by the founders of the New England kitchen are still with us. How to supply the national need for food that is inexpensive and easily available, but also nutritious and compatible with the tastes of most Americans. The time may be ripe for another set of reformers to come along and try to straighten us all out. If so, they would do well to avoid the mistakes made by the New England kitchen, but they could also draw inspiration from the courage, hard work, and concern for human health displayed by these admirable Boston pioneers. So about them, although I found them misguided, I still admired their concerns and their goal. And it would have been too simple just to condemn them as being insensitive. Both things had to be pointed out. Well, what I did with this story in the book I've written, From Hardtack to Home Fries, was to embed it in the broader story of social reformers in America that used food as a way to get Americans to change themselves. I see this as a consistent theme in our history, that we all think that by improving ourselves, that we can somehow change our culture and perhaps even the world. That explains a lot of the self-improvement literature that we all get. And the whole business of food reforming is really a mid or early 1830s phenomenon in America. And what drew me into this story was what I know from women's history. You all know about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of our best American feminists. She lived in Boston from about 1843 to 1847, and she and her husband were very prominent abolitionists. And I came across this. It was just a tiny, again, a footnote in a biography of hers, but it captured my imagination, and off I went with it. And here is the piece. The plump cheeks of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, leading intellectual and prominent reformer for abolition and suffrage, attested that she enjoyed a square meal at the end of the day. In her later years, Stanton reflected on meeting for the first time in 1840 Angelina and Theodore Weld, well-known fellow reformers who lived on a farm in New Jersey in a house she described as cheerless, quote, destitute of all tasteful womanly touches. Tired from her journey, Stanton longed for hot tea or coffee and possibly a beefsteak with the usual trimmings. As she woefully recalled, they came not. Instead, she was served cold oatmeal and apples with only water to drink. And I asked the question, how did this happen? How was it that the Welds, who went on this farm in New York State, took on this kind of eating and consumption and served their guests this kind of food? And it's a complicated, very complicated story. It didn't come so much out of religious conviction, because their religious background did not forbid them from serving meat or other more flavorable edibles. Rather, their austere diet was part of a doctrine set down by a food reformer called Sylvester Graham, whose health principles appealed to many mid-century Americans. Now, there were a lot of people reforming Americans in the middle of the 19th century because there was so much wrong with Americans. But he was the one who focused on food as a way of making social change. Known now only for the brown cracker that bears his name, Graham was the forerunner of a long line of crusaders, crackpots, and enterprising capitalists who have shaped the food habits of all Americans. The popularity of his Spartan diet was in part because for most Americans in the early 19th century, it seemed easier to fix oneself than so much else in the country that needed fixing. Slavery was still a social norm. Women throughout the U.S. were not allowed to vote or own property, and were expected to wear cage-like corsets and long skirts that could easily catch fire near open hearths. Children were considered the property of their parents. Medical practice of the day was primitive. Spittoons for chewing tobacco attested to the general indifference to public sanitation, and the typical American diet was not much better, consisting largely of corn, pork, molasses, puddings, and pies, and potatoes cooked in lard, with plenty of whiskey to wash it all down. So this is what Americans living then saw all around them. And so Graham felt that his work was cut out for him. And for some reason, and I figured out why, he landed on bread as the principal food for reform. He had a whole book on bread making, rather boring little book, goes on and on and on about using bread and using the whole wheat and so on. But out of that book comes the whole story, and it's sheer invention of how a mother should bake bread for her children and so on. And I came to learn that Graham was one of 17 children, the last in the line of 17 children by one father and two mothers. And his old father died, leaving his mother with all those children to take care of. She went a little crazy. And he never grew up in a real home, but was passed around to all kinds of relatives. And so all of his romanticism about bread was really compensatory, it seems to me, about the neglect that he himself experienced as a kid. He extended a very vigorous form of vegetarianism to include no drinking of alcohol, no sex at all, maybe for procreation, but he wasn't always sure. And to be avoided were all condiments and spices such as pepper, ginger, mustard, cinnamon, and horseradish, which he considered all highly exciting and exhausting. So he saw sexual connotations in the hot foods. Dairy products, including milk, eggs, and butter, were not altogether forbidden, but should only be used sparingly and carefully. Cheese was permitted if it was mild and not aged. Coffee, tea, alcohol, and tobacco were considered poisons, as were drugs offered by physicians and other medical practitioners. All medicine, as such, is itself an evil, he said. He insisted at a time when all medical licensing laws were rescinded or unenforced, and any quack could call himself a doctor. His popularity was really quite unique. He attracted thousands of followers who attended his lectures and adhered to his dietetic plan known as the Graham system. And in Boston and New York, Graham temperance boarding houses for men sprang up, offering meals based on his program. You had to be there, and you had to go to bed by 9 or 10 o'clock at night, otherwise the door would be locked. You had to get up very early in the morning for exercise and drink a lot of water all day and eat those Spartan meals. And a lot of businessmen, like people go to spas today, went there to get cleansed. What's interesting about Graham, as I say, is that he influenced so many other people. And so that the whole chain of vegetarianism, I trace from him to Ellen White, who was a Seventh-day Adventist. She was influenced by Graham. And she justified vegetarianism in moral terms. Vegetarian comes up in every period of our history, and there's always a different context for it. White, in the middle of the 19th century, she justified it on both religious and psychological grounds. And she said, God gave our parents the food he designed the race should eat. It was contrary to his plan to have the life of any creature taken. Years later, she would put Genesis aside and point to the harm it seemed to her meat eating does to those who slaughter animals and witness the killing. Think of the cruelty meat eating involves, she wrote, and its effects on those who inflict and those who behold it, how it destroys the tenderness with which we should regard those creatures of God. We've heard variations on that theme to this day. And what's interesting about White, apart from her own interesting background, is that she started something called the Western Health Reform Institute that promised that she with signs for Adventists to come to Michigan, to go to the sanitarium, and she said, whatever may be the nature of their disease, if curable, they can be cured here. So Adventists throughout the country began flocking to Michigan, Battle Creek, in pursuit of relief from ailments American medicine of the day could not help. Over the next 75 years, the Institute would overcome a variety of financial and administrative obstacles and expand to become the Battle Creek Sanitarium, the largest and best-known health resort in the United States. The SAN, as it came to be called, would also become a model for modern American health spas. If anybody read or saw The Road to Wellness, that book and that not-so-good movie tell that story. And to head up the Institute, she appointed one Dr. John Henry Kellogg, who would become the next major figure to spread Graham's vegetarian legacy and would forever change America's breakfasts. Like all the meals, Americans ate meat and steak and chops and things like that early in the morning, right up until he invented cold cereals and others came along behind him to do the same thing. Kellogg displayed the classic profile of the food reformer, experiencing chronic sickliness as a child that fueled a quest for ways to establish and maintain better health. His reading of Sylvester Graham created an epiphany, causing him to convert to vegetarianism, and as we say, the rest is history. He had a very hard-working wife. Ella Kellogg played an important backstage role in development of many of the grain and nut products as served at the San and later sold to the consumer public. I don't know if any of you remember what vegetarian cuisine used to be like. It was always brown. It was ground nuts and grains and shaped into a cutlet. Very different from what we think of today as vegetarian food, which is often salads and fresh foods. Before it was stodgy and was made to resemble meat. It was all, and he was into that kind of thing, always grinding up nuts and shaping them into recognizable things. So poor Ella was assigned to the tedious job of endlessly testing recipes to ensure that they were dry enough to avoid becoming moldy, but not so hard, this is breakfast thing, that they would break teeth. And one of the spa's clients actually did break her dentures on a piece of Zwieback toast. Nor was operating this kitchen Ella Kellogg's only job. Though their marriage was famously celibate, the Kelloggs collected more than 40 orphaned and abandoned children whose care was largely the responsibility of Mrs. Kellogg. She effectively became a cartoon of what was expected of most 19th century American women, chained to a kitchen that was also a laboratory and to a nursery that was actually a foster home and an orphan asylum. When not inventing new foods or advocating sexual repression, Kellogg was developing electric or mechanical gadgets designed to improve health. One of his favorite innovations was an electromechanical exercise horse, a model of which wound up in the White House during the presidency of Calvin Coolidge. He also developed or adapted a number of vibrating devices for improving blood circulation and digestion, including a chair that oscillated 20 times a second and a vibrating belt that became a standard for years in weight-reducing salons. Other inventions included the dynamometer, a strength-testing instrument that helped determine appropriate muscular exercises, an arc light battery that anticipated the modern tanning salon, and the first menthol inhaler used to clear nasal passages. Well, I move along, going from Graham, and I work in this chapter the story of the New England kitchen as well, all making the point of how people, reformers, use food toward their end, and often the mission would be extremely different one from the other. And I bring the story up to date by talking about the current phenomenon of changing oneself in order to improve one's life, which I think has to do with weight loss books and diet books. And for me, diet books are wonderful barometers of popular culture. In recent years, for example, a number of the books have been offering weight loss solutions that are part of a fundamentalist or evangelical view of life. They would have us dieting for Jesus or looking to Buddha for ways to abate a ravenous appetite. And New Age diet books now try to persuade us not to feed our inner child with junk food, but to substitute meatlessness and meditation for McDonald's. But the latest diet literature to date tends toward the psychological, offering techniques of behavior modification that encourages readers to take long walks or hot baths whenever they feel the need to raid the refrigerator. Either that, or they will advise those of us who are overweight to forgive ourselves. The message is such therapy-oriented diet books, in such books is, it's not your fault. That message is also implied, if not directly stated, in books that show readers how to tailor diets to their astrological signs or even to their blood types. And I confess at the end of this chapter to one of my favorite reading pleasures is to read diet books written by celebrities, which is always a mistake because by the time the book is published, they generally have gained all the weight back. Nevertheless, I love them. And the part I like best are what I call the personal testimonials or the fat narratives. This is where the authors, including some of the medical professionals, a lot of formerly fat doctors write books, confess to pat histories of obesity. They then offer up conversion stories about how they finally saw the light after years of battling their weight and explain why they now want to pass on their hard-won wisdom. The celebrity diet books have the longest and juiciest fat narratives and the least amount of bad science and psychobabble. And among this subspecies of weight loss literature, I am especially fond of Renee Taylor's My Life on a Diet, Confessions of a Hollywood Diet Junkie. She's a comedy writer and actress whose dress size fluctuated between a short-lived size 6 and a 16. And the book is essentially a showbiz memoir that is driven by Taylor's confession to a lifelong history of binge eating that she claims she was finally able to get under control. She describes herself as a diet slut because she moves from one to the other, always thinking that the next one will probably overcome the problem. And she describes herself as having the spirit of Audrey Hepburn and the appetite of Orson Welles. Anyway, I just really love this book a lot. And the whole point of going through this literature is that, you know, I still see that as a continuum from the 19th century reformers who suggested that we should, you know, change ourselves and then we will change, you know, every life for the better. Sylvester Graham, John Kellogg, Ellen White, and the founders of the New England Kitchen were moralists who delivered their sober messages to true believers. To the modern reader with some scientific knowledge, these diet reformers are interesting because they are quirky and misguided, but even so appeal to great numbers of followers. In contrast, celebrity diet books are irresistible because, like much else in contemporary society, they play not to our sense of self-restraint, but to prurience. We see the naked truth about celebrities wrestling with their weight. My second favorite book was written by Elizabeth Taylor, who wrote a book called Elizabeth Takes Off. When she exposes all her marriages and talks about, you know, why her marriage to John Warner, the Republican senator from Virginia, didn't work, and so on. And that's, you know, when she reformed, and she suggests in her book that she's dieting for us because she's a national figure. She owes it to her fans, really, to slim down. But she's good-natured and wonderful, and you know, the book is absolutely a wonderful read. I wind up trying to think, what would Sylvester Graham have thought of our country's fixation, which is even more true today, on fat? Since he singled out gluttony as the worst of the deadly sins, Graham surely would be appalled by the obesity afflicting more than half our citizens. But Graham, unlike the celebrities and psychologists, would link the problem to moral failure. Oversized bodies for him were proof not only of gluttony, but of wickedness. He would see the present-day popularity of coffee houses as a sign of how far we had strayed, not to mention the national hamburger habit. As for the diet books, he would mourn the loss of a religious foundation in most of them, and surely abhor our selfish reasons for reading them to look better, have better love lives, and, quote, feel good about ourselves. Those books that limit or abstain from meat eating or offer faith-based methods of weight loss may have met with his approval. There's a book that I love. It's called More of Jesus, Less of Me, a title that brings a smile to the faces of most people, would most certainly not have amused the humorless Mr. Graham. Is America beyond salvation, I ask? The fine quality of bread now available in America might have saved us in Graham's eyes were he alive today. After years of packaged sliced bread as the only bread available outside of ethnic bakeries, we now can find honest loaves of crusty whole wheat bread in ordinary neighborhood supermarkets everywhere. The renaissance of what is called artisanal bread is one of the great food stories of the late 20th century, and one that certainly would have satisfied Sylvester Graham. So there you are. I have slides that I'm going to show you. I chose not to interrupt my remarks, but to save until the end some of the images that I feel go pretty much with the people or the times that I've been talking about. I love this picture. It's a picture of New York tunnel workers, and it looks almost like a sculpture in my eyes. And, you know, they're eating thick bready sandwiches, I hope, with salami in them, and I hope that it had a lot of garlic and that they're enjoying themselves. These were the people that our Boston reformers really wanted to get with it, again, for the best intentions in the world, feeling that if only they assimilated, they would do better, and their kids would do better. But they didn't understand what food meant. And I think this is Mulberry Street in New York, the whole immigrant experience. Bread sellers on the streets. It's backwards, sorry. These are girls learning to cook. There were a lot of settlement house cooking schools that went on and to teach the foreign-born the American way of life through food. This is Boston. This is, it's backwards, sorry. It's Quincy Market in Boston, and it looks to me, post-World War II. And this is a family, this is a typical situation. On one side, a family is rolling out bread dough, and on the other, the children and relatives, other people, are making paper flowers to sell. Everybody around the table being enterprising in different ways. It's a Louis Hine photograph, again, of an Italian family at table. And this is a Jewish Seder, holiday Seder. And again, a bread seller on the street. You can see the breads would just be tumbled, not exactly sanitary. One of my pet peeves is that when stores put crusty loaves of bread into thick plastic holders that collapse the loaves. I used to go around scolding people in charge of that department, and I would get back lectures on sanitation, and thought it was a lost cause. Someday when I'm even older, I'll wear a cape and a pointy hat and pick it up again. This is a bakery. Sorry, again, it's backwards, but this is a bakery that still exists in New York. I showed this slide at a food conference, and people got really excited, New Yorkers who know that store. It's still there. Backyard ovens. Again, they're coming back into vogue. Wouldn't we all love to have a brick oven in our own backyards to bake bread with? Or backyard tomatoes. And people, Italians especially, are very enterprising about how they grew things. Still, we all know neighbors or friends who do this, and it's wonderful. And these were all market gardeners and people who delivered food to neighborhoods, and old-fashioned delicatessens, Jewish bakery, pasta on the street. And this is a macaroni factory in Oklahoma, as I recall. And this is an Italian, some Italian association, only men, obviously, each one with a couple of bottles, a red and a white wine for each guy. And this is the young, this is Sylvester Graham, sorry. Yeah, and that's Ellen White to the right, sitting down with her family. And the bloomer costume was another cause of concern in the 19th century. Women were expected to dress as they were on the left, with tight corsets and long skirts. And the ability to wear pants and to move around with more freedom was a hard-fought freedom. And actually, it failed in the 19th century because the feminists who dressed that way were so scorned and derided. This is an earliest form of the Sanitarium. And there's the young John Kellogg. And he became a serious eccentric. Always wore a white suit in his older years. And he lived into his 90s. And there's the second version of the Sanitarium. And it's one of his mechanical advice. He did a lot with water. There was enemas and forced drinking of water and hydrotherapy of various sorts that really make no sense at all. I love this picture. It's a dance, but it's a sanitary dance. People don't touch one another. Exercise. And, these odd gear, this diaper outfit, and working on this strange Kellogg equipment. And women working in the kitchen diligently. And here, it went on strongly until about the 1950s, and obviously it doesn't exist anymore. It was used by the government during World War II, and it never came back. Okay, that's the lot. Thank you very much. We have time for a couple questions. Right here. Well, wait for the mic, please. Okay, we're recording.
How long did the New England kitchen last? How many years?
It was a 3-year experiment. They were able to get an infusion of money in and open more places, and they had hoped to extend it to New York, and they really had big plans. But after 3 years, they saw it wasn't going to work. There was another question? There's a question in the back. We'll wait for the mic, sir. Okay. Could you hand the mic to him? Oh, is there a question here? All right.
Does this work? Okay. What year did cold cereals come into vogue?
Early first decade of the 20th century. Grape nuts was one of the first, and all kinds of health claims were made for it. And of course it still exists. And one of the unusual, very New England desserts still is a grape nut pudding that you don't find anyplace else in America. Hello.
Hi. A little late, so if you mention, sorry.
Can't hear you.
People such as the who are working on the New England kitchen have any contact with. We're trying to do what Charlotte Perkins Gilman wanted, that is communication, so that each isn't a slave to her kitchen.
I understand. The question is, were the people I was talking about in the New England kitchen connected at all with a woman, a very famous woman in America, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who was an advocate of the kitchenless home, where she wanted all housekeeping duties to be professionalized? No, they weren't. This group was interested in getting the working poor to learn sanitation and to change into full-blooded Americans and giving up their old world ways. It was a very different concept. I think that, from what I know of Gilman, she would have approved of it because she was a xenophobe, as you probably know. She didn't like foreigners at all, right? Anything else? There's a question.
I'm from Jamaica Plain, where Ellen Swallow Richards' house is still standing with the plaque. Two questions quickly. One is, I heard that there was a restaurant associated with the New England kitchen. Did they branch out and actually serve meals in the kitchen eventually?
They did hope to do that. Where they met with success was at the Chicago World's Fair. And one of the big hits in the women's building was the restaurant that they established, and they were able to demonstrate, mainly Abel, the home economist, was able to demonstrate all of the vision that the group held, keeping the costs down, serving wholesome food. She was very proud of that bread that she worked on, and of course, middle class people bought those meals.
And the second question was, I also heard that upper-class people attended the kitchen and took home meals, so that it was almost 50-50 at one time?
That could be. I don't know those statistics, but it was not the aim of the founders of the kitchen to provide fast food for well-heeled people. But that's what would happen, I'm sure. Because the food would be familiar and available and appetizing to them.